All right, it's time to talk about Florida State. Good morning, it's Uncle Lou here. That's right, it is me, Uncle Lou, live on YouTube for you. Thanks for watching. Another pointless, barely watchable, head-scratching, and hair-raising edition of the Uncle Lou Show. I've done a whole series of prediction and preview videos for a whole bunch of college football teams. I think I've done 25 or 30 so far. We're going to keep them going right up until the start of the season, which of course is just around the corner. This weekend coming up, happy Thursday, by the way, but this weekend coming up is our last weekend without college football. So it's really here now, getting down to the nitty gritty. But we're going to talk about Florida State today. I'm going to give you a preview, what they lose, what's coming back, what they might look like in 2024. And then I'm going to put the schedule up on the screen and go through it game by game. And I'll give you a winner and a loser for every single week. There we go. Florida State head coach Mike Norvell, been there since 2020, which was probably the worst. That's a hard time to get hired. Coaches that got hired that year kind of started out behind the eight ball, the whole COVID deal. You had all kinds of recruiting restrictions and visit restrictions, and you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that, and you only played a limited number of games. It was just a complete mess. So it was sort of rough on everybody. But if you were a coach, if you were a first-year coach in 2020, I think it was particularly rough. I think that's the case for Mike Norvell. And it didn't start out well. Now, he inherited a complete mess, too, to be fair. Willie Taggart drug that program into the mud. But 2020, 3-6. Then the following year, 2021, they were 5-7. A couple of years ago, had a pretty good year, 10-3. And then last year, of course, 13 and, what's that say? 1. 13-1, but still a really good year for. I promise I'm going to try to make that the last Orange Bowl joke I make. Okay, I'm going to try my best to stay away from that. Let's get serious. This is a serious channel. And I'm a serious person. So let's get serious here. Let's get buttoned up here as we're discussing the Florida State Seminoles. So when you look at this overall record here, you can look at it one of two ways. You can say, well, he's been there 2 years and half the time he's had a losing record. That's true, 3-6, 5-7. Or you can look at it and go, every year he's been there, they've gotten better. That's also true. 3 wins, 5 wins, 10 wins, 13 wins, capped off by, of course, an ACC championship and a berth in a New Year's Six bowl game. Now, they did lose a lot off of last year's team, and Florida State is a little bit of a case study in regards to the transfer portal. Everyone uses the transfer portal. Florida State has leaned heavily on the transfer portal. Now, they haven't forsaken high school recruiting like Colorado and Deion have. But if you look over the last couple of years, the majority of their standout players, or maybe a majority is the wrong word, a significant number of their standout players they have acquired through the portal, right? You look at the wide receivers last year, some of the key pieces of that defense, tight end Jaheim Bell. And it's going to be a similar situation this year. When we look at this year's roster, you're going to see transfers from other places on both sides of the ball, in a lot of places on both sides of the ball for Florida State. And it's worked out pretty well. I actually think Mike Norvell has threaded this needle of, okay, you know, you have to build for the future through recruiting, right? But it's a what have you done for me now, not even lately. It's a what have you done for me now sort of era of college football. So can you use the portal to bridge that gap between where you're at now and where you want to be 2, 3, 4 years down the road when your recruiting classes start to backfill and stack up? And I think Mike Norvell has done a pretty good job of that at Florida State. They're the favorite to win the ACC heading into 2024. They have a favorable schedule, especially the first half. First half of the schedule is favorable, which is good when you're talking about a team that's going to have a lot of new pieces to break in on both sides of the ball. So the first half of the schedule is manageable. They do have some difficult road games, 3 difficult road games, 2 of them in the back half of the schedule. In a 3-week period. We'll get to the schedule in a second. But let's look at the offense and the defense and see what it's going to look like for this upcoming season. Now, the offense, they've got to replace their quarterback, their top 2 wide receivers, their top running back, and their most productive tight end. That's a lot of replacement there on the offensive side of the ball. But I mentioned the portal before. You'll see what they've done here in a second. At quarterback, they lose Jordan Travis, right? But they bring in DJ Uiagalelei. I do know how to say his name, so there you go. I got that out of the way. Now the rest of the video, I can call him Ukulele or Oogie Badoogie or whatever, and you'll know I do know how to pronounce his name. But they bring in the Ukulele. Started out at Clemson. It didn't go well there. He transferred to Oregon State. and didn't do much better there. I mean, we can talk about offensive styles and schemes and philosophies, but if you watch the games and you just kind of look at the numbers, there wasn't a big difference from what he did at Clemson versus what he did at Oregon State. He wasn't terrible. I'm not suggesting he was terrible, but no one has him on their top 10 quarterback list either. Let's just put it that way. And Oregon State, of course, sort of wandering the desert in no man's land after the Pac-12 collapsed and no one picked them up. So the ukulele enters the portal again. This time lands at Florida State to take the reins from Jordan Travis. So he will be the quarterback. Who will he be throwing the ball to? Well, I mentioned they lose their top 2 wide receivers, Keon Coleman and Wilson. They're both gone. But they do get 3 wide receivers back who were serious contributors last season, whether you want to call them wide receivers 3, 4, and 5, whatever you want to call them. Their best 2 receivers are gone. The next 3 wide receivers return. So they've got some experience back at the wide receiver position there. And they went out and utilized the portal. They brought in a guy from Bama, Benson, I believe was his name, and they brought Brown in from LSU. These guys didn't set the world on fire at the wide receiver position at Bama or LSU. This isn't a Keon Coleman. This isn't a Keon Coleman situation from last season, right? Keon Coleman was a proven commodity, a star wide receiver on a bad team at Michigan State, came to Florida State and had a great year. These 2 players here have potential from Bama and LSU, but they didn't light it up last year. Now you can say, well, they were behind other highly rated players, or you could say whatever you want. And I'm not saying they won't be good at Florida State. They are less of a sure thing than Keon Coleman was, I think, coming in from Michigan State. But they don't need to hit on both of them. But I think one of those 2 wide receivers needs to be a significant contributor for Florida State this season. At the running back room, it's a similar situation. You lose Benson, and you did have some players behind him that are back this year, but no real established star like you had with Benson. There's some talented kids in that running back room, no doubt about it, no question about it. And maybe one of them, or more than one of them, ends up being better than Benson at some point down the road. I'm not looking at Florida State's running back room necessarily as a negative, but it is a question mark. We don't really know for certain how good it's going to be. I do think it'll be some amount of good. I don't think it's going to be bad. Will one or more of those guys sort of emerge as sort of the top dog there in the running back room and sort of fill Benson's shoes? We'll see. At tight end, they lost 3 of their top 4 tight ends last year, including, like I mentioned, Jaheim Bell, who they had picked up in the portal as well a couple of years ago out of South Carolina. There was 3 of their top 4 tight ends, so they got to replace some pieces and some production there. Offensive line, I think, is the strong suit of this Florida State offense, at least heading into the season. Again, I'm not suggesting that these wide receivers or these running backs are bad, but they're not proven. I don't think they're making any All-American teams heading into the season, any preseason All-American teams. Doesn't mean they won't be great, right? But there are questions. I think that's a fair way to put it. Heading into last season, there were some clear stars heading into last season that we already knew. Benson at running back, Keon Coleman at wide receiver, Wilson at wide receiver, Jordan Travis at quarterback. These were known commodities. We knew who they were, and we knew they were good. I'm not saying these wide receivers and running backs aren't good or can't be good, but we don't know that they are yet. We'll have to wait and see how they perform on Saturdays. But with the offensive line, we do know what we're getting. And what we're getting is an offensive line with a ton of experience. Their starting offensive linemen have 190 starts between them. This is a ton of experience. It's a good offensive line. I think that will be the strong suit of the offense, which is good for a quarterback who may need a week or 2 to sort of get going in this offense. He should have good protection behind this offensive line. And the same thing for the running backs looking for holes. I don't think the offensive line is going to have a problem opening up holes for these running backs, particularly when you see the schedule early in the season. Let's move over to the defensive side of the ball. It's a similar story. They do get a little bit more production back on defense, in my opinion. Some potential star caliber names that you might recognize over there. Now, of course, they do lose Jared Verse, who was probably, well, y'all can argue, the Florida State fans can argue about whether he was the best defensive player on that team last year. He was one of the most productive and one of the most dominant for sure, and he's off to the NFL, very highly drafted into the league. So got to replace him. We'll see what they do there. But they do get some key pieces back. Peyton, Farmer, Lundy, Thomas, Brown. These are familiar names, and maybe not to the entire college football world, but if you're a Florida State fan, you recognize these names from last season. So in other words, you get some key contributing pieces back on the defensive side of the ball, more so than you do over on the offense. Like the offense, though, they brought in a lot of key transfers. And again, I haven't even really mentioned recruiting. They've recruited well. I tried to make that point at the beginning of the video. This isn't a team that's built solely through the portal, okay? It's not. They've got young, talented players that are inexperienced that may become household names this season or next or whatever the case. But when it comes to immediate impact right away, obviously transfer portals are important because the majority of the time these players are going to have experience and be proven already at the college level. So they've got a great mix there. We'll see how they choose to utilize it. But they brought in a ton of transfers over on the defensive side of the ball as well. They brought in a guy from West Virginia, from Oregon State, from Bama. They got Marvin Jones Jr. from Georgia. Extremely talented linebacker out of Georgia. He wasn't able to get a whole lot of playing time at Georgia, not because he's not any good. Georgia recruits pretty good all the way around. They recruit the best at the linebacker position, so it just becomes really, really hard to move up the depth chart at linebacker at UGA. So Marvin Jones has decided to transfer out of there down to Tallahassee, and he'll probably start right away, and I think he'll be really, really good. He's a great player. Just kind of lost in the shuffle there at UGA. Again, the schedule, I mentioned this, and let's go ahead and put the schedule up now. This is a favorable schedule early on, I think, for Florida State when you look at some of these games. The majority of these games are winnable. The majority of these games, Florida State will be significant favorites, double-digit type favorites. The other thing you'll notice about this schedule, 3 bye weeks for Florida State. Now, everybody gets 2 bye weeks this year just because of the way the calendar falls, just the number of Saturdays between Labor Day and Conference Championship Saturday requires 2 bye weeks as opposed to the usual 1. But because Florida State is playing a week 0 game, this game at Georgia Tech is being played in Dublin, Ireland, 9 days from today. It's Thursday as I'm recording this video. 9 days from today, Florida State kicks it off with Georgia Tech in Dublin, Ireland. That's a week 0 game. So because they're playing a week 0, they get the 2 additional bye weeks that everybody gets plus a third bye week. And then I look at the back half of the schedule, and it is a lot more difficult than the front half. Now, you've got SMU and Clemson on the front half of the schedule, and I think those are interesting and potentially tricky games there. But if you look on the back half of the schedule, clearly that's what stands out, right? You've got on the road at Miami, on the road at Notre Dame, in-state rival Florida. Now, I don't think Florida's very good, but nevertheless, that's a big game every single year for Florida State. And if you even want to throw the Duke game in there, I don't think Duke's going to be very good or pose much of a challenge for Florida State. But this is 3 road games in a 4-week period without any bye weeks. So you play 4 games in a row, 3 of them are on the road. That can be tricky. That can be difficult. These are young kids in a lot of cases that have never done a lot of traveling. You don't know how they might react to, back and forth on a plane multiple times in a month. We'll see. But back-to-back road games can be tricky. And in this case, 3 road games in a 4-week period. So that's just kind of what first jumps out at me when I look at this schedule. Let's go through it. I'm going to do my best to give you a winner and a loser for every single week. Now, like I mentioned, start off with Georgia Tech. I think this might be the most important game of the season for Florida State. If you've watched my channel in the offseason at all, then you've probably heard me talk about this before. And this is not a trash talking video, by the way. These are straight laced. This is just my honest opinions in these videos here. I am a little concerned that Florida State in general, whether you're talking about administration, staff, players, fans, program, athletic department, whatever, I am a little concerned about the amount of time that seems to be devoted to things in the rearview mirror and things that have nothing to do with what happens on Saturdays in the fall. And I'm, of course, talking about the playoff snub from last year. And look, I do think it was a playoff snub. I said before, Florida State should have got in. If I was on the committee, I would have voted them in. I also said, I understand how they got left out. If you want to, the playoff committee, it was the best 4, the deserving 4. I don't want to go back down that road again. But 8-9 months later, there seems to be still a lot of looking over their shoulder, pointing backwards, wanting to relitigate that over and over and over again. They want to burn Kirk Herbstreit's house down. They want to set fire to the ESPN building in Connecticut. They've got some massive top secret plan that they won't tell anybody about something that they're doing in Dublin, Ireland that's anti-ESPN and anti-playoff committee and anti-Kirk Herbstreit. And, this isn't fair. We were mistreated. And I get it. I'd be pissed off too. But any of us would be pissed off if we went 13-0 and didn't get in the playoffs. But it just seems like a lot of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with this year. And I'm wondering what effect, if any, that'll have on the team. Then you've got the lawsuits. And again, this isn't anything directly involving the players, but it's just around. You can't ignore it. You know, they're suing their TV partner. They're suing their own conference. They're constantly being asked about it. Are they going to end up in the Big Ten? Are they going to end up in the SEC? Now rumors of the Big 12, and the fans aren't happy with that. But, you know, it just seems like a lot going on around Florida State that is not focused on the upcoming season. A lot of ancillary noise, let's call it. And I just don't know what effect, if any, that will have on the football team this fall. It's possible that this football team has turtle shelled and just blocking everything out, and they don't even know how mad the fans are about 9 months ago still, and lawsuits and what league are we in, and it's possible they've got no idea, or it's possible it's such a distraction and it's just so much outside noise that it's made it almost impossible for them to focus on the task at hand, which is this football season. And for those reasons, I think this Georgia Tech game is extremely important. On top of that, Georgia Tech is a team that's headed in the right direction. Now, are they close to supplanting Florida State or Clemson or whatever team as being the class of the ACC? No, and I'm not suggesting that at all. Lord knows it's not my job to come on here and pump up Georgia Tech. But if you look at where they're at today under Brent Key versus where they were a couple of years ago under Jeff Collins, it's clearly a night and day difference, all right? They are headed in the right direction. Their recruiting is up. The play on the field is up. The overall attitude and sort of feeling around the program is 180 from where it was a couple of years ago. They pulled off a couple of upset wins last year. And regardless of what I think, or you as a Florida State fan think, or a talking head on TV thinks, or whatever the case, Georgia Tech does think they can win this game. Now, Florida State's a significant favorite. They started out as about a 13-point favorite, but that number has been bet all the way down to 10.5 or 11, depending on where you look. If you don't follow betting, that's okay. That just means that when the line came out at Florida State favored by 13, that means a lot of people started betting on Georgia Tech. And so it drove the line down to 10 or 11. Doesn't mean Georgia Tech's going to win the game. But I do think this is a dangerous game. I don't think this is like, Georgia Tech's not going to catch Florida State napping here, like looking past this game. It's the first game of the year. They've been looking for this, towards this game for 8 months. But I do think if Florida State shows up and things don't go well, particularly early in the game, and Georgia Tech gets a little bit of confidence and maybe some momentum, it's going to be interesting to see how Florida State responds to that. Let's keep in mind the last time we saw Florida State take the field, they lost by 60 points. And I know that was the second and the third team, and the starters weren't playing, and they went off to the draft. I get that. But you know who was playing? Almost everybody that's playing in this game against Georgia Tech. That's who, with the exception of the transfers. I think Florida State wins this game, but if you're looking for like a watch out game or something on this schedule, I would put an asterisk by this Georgia Tech game, but I think Florida State gets it done. They start 1-0. That's in week 0. Then they have a week 1 game, which is when everyone else will start playing. They play back at home in Tallahassee against Boston College. This was a crazy game last year, a game Florida State probably should have lost. It definitely could have lost. They were trailing almost the entire game. They came back and won by, I believe, 2 points at the end. I don't think that'll be the case this year. I think Florida State takes care of business in their first home game, no problem, and blows Boston College out. They then get their first bye week. Again, they're going to get 3. This is their first one here. They come out of that and they play Memphis. This is another game that I would not circle, but maybe put a little asterisk next to if you're a Florida State fan. You're way better than Memphis, but you got the Mike Norvell-Memphis connection, right? Mike Norvell came from Memphis, for those watching that might not know. And Memphis is one of the group of 5 teams that is getting mentioned this year as a potential playoff team. You remember, we're going to 12 playoff teams now. So one group of 5 team is guaranteed a playoff spot, one and only one. And it's going to be basically the highest rated group of 5 conference champion. And again, whether I think Memphis will be that team or you think Memphis will be that team, Memphis thinks they can be that team. And one of the ways to prove that, and you don't get very many opportunities as a group of 5 team to prove it, one of the ways they could prove it would be by going into Tallahassee and beating Florida State. Now, again, I don't think that's going to happen. I'm taking Florida State to beat Memphis. But this is an interesting game and maybe one to keep an eye on. And then Cal at home. So one of the new additions to the ACC. Of course, they added Cal, Stanford, and SMU. Get Cal at home. I think Cal's terrible. In fact, I think they might be the worst team in the ACC this year. I think you'll get a win there, no problem. And then you got to go on the road and play SMU. And SMU, even though they're a group of 5 team, or used to be technically, they're not built like a group of 5 team. SMU is a legitimate team. SMU is going to win a lot of Power 5 games this year. They're in the ACC. They're going to win some ACC games this year. And this is their first ACC game. This will be SMU's first quote-unquote Power 4 or Power 5 game, whatever you want to call it, in 30, 40 years since they got kicked out of football back in the 80s with the Pony Express scandal and that what was on ESPN 30 for 30. This is a massive game for SMU. I can't over-exaggerate how big of a game this is for the people in and around the SMU program. You're talking about a program that's got access to a ton of money. It's got a ton of diehard fans that have been fans for the last 30 years while they've been fighting back from the NCAA death penalty that was handed to them in the 80s. And you got to play them there. I think SMU wins this game. This is just a bad spot here. I wouldn't want to be any ACC team playing SMU in their first ACC game on the road at SMU. Massive upset here. Am I going to be surprised if I'm wrong and Florida State wins this game by 3 touchdowns? No, not at all, because Florida State's 3-4 touchdowns better than SMU. No question about it. No question about it. And they've got a good defense, and defense travels and all that kind of thing. So, but this is, we see a couple of massive upsets every single year in the world of college football. I think this is going to be one of them. I think Florida State goes on the road and gets beat by SMU. That's the bad news. Good news is you come back home, play Clemson, and you win. I'm down on Clemson. They're headed in the wrong direction. Their offensive line is a mess. Their wide receiver situation is a mess. Their quarterback is worse than yours. Cade Klubnik has been a disaster. I guarantee you never get him to admit it, but if Dabo could go back in time, he'd keep ukulele and ship Klubnik off to Oregon State. Guaranteed. This guy's a turnover machine, doesn't know what he's doing. Dabo's got some blame here too. We talked at the beginning about how good Florida State has gotten through both recruiting for the long term and using the portal to get better immediately. Clemson has completely ignored the portal. Just completely ignored it to their own detriment. They've gotten worse basically every single year since they won the national title in 2018. Their losses have gotten higher every single year since 2018. They lost 4 games last year, including getting blown out by Duke, including a loss at home to Florida State. And I think you beat them at home this year. You beat them at Clemson last year. You'll beat them at home this year. I've got you beating Clemson. Then you get your second bye week. Let me go back to SMU real quick. SMU's about a 500 team this year. They might win 7-5, maybe 8-4, something like that. I don't think they're really good. That has nothing to do with why I'm picking them to beat Florida State. They've got no chance to win the ACC, in my opinion, or even make the ACC title game. And again, Florida State could go to Dallas and beat SMU by 3 touchdowns, and it wouldn't surprise me. Almost every single team, every single year, loses at least one game you don't expect them to lose, and wins a game maybe you don't expect them to win. Sometimes you go undefeated. Florida State had an undefeated regular season last year, but more times than not, you tend to lose a game. So I know I'm going to catch a lot of heat from that. No, I'm not putting money on that. I wouldn't bet for Florida State go in there and win. It's an obvious upset that I just think potentially could happen, okay? All right, so then you bye week after Clemson, halfway through your season, you're sitting on just 1 loss, looking good. Remember, the goal should be, in my opinion, especially if you're Florida State, I think you'll understand this, the goal should be to get to the playoffs. Not necessarily to win your conference, because we saw what happened last year. Now, you're guaranteed to get into the playoffs if you win your conference this year, but halfway through the season, you're looking good, sitting on just 1 loss, you'll be ranked in the top 10, all of that kind of stuff. And then it gets a little bit more difficult with the road games and the opponents. Here's that 4-game stretch where you have to play 3 road games at Duke, at Miami, back-to-back, home against North Carolina, and then on the road against Notre Dame. I do think you'll beat Duke. I like the hire of Manny Diaz there at Duke. I hate that they lost Elko. He obviously was a really good coach, but Texas A&M has snatched him up. They've got a quarterback through the portal that they think can be really good, and I do think Manny Diaz will sort of take Duke and where Elko got him to and potentially bump him up another notch or 2. Don't know if it will happen this year, though, and even if it does, I don't think they're beating Florida State. You have to play them there, but that stadium holds about 11,000 people or whatever it is. You'll go in there and get the job done. Then you got to go on the road to Miami, and I've done a Miami prediction video. Most of you have probably already seen it. I think Miami wins the game this year. I think this is going to be a great game. I think this is going to harken back to some of the great Miami versus Florida State games from 20 and 30 years ago that I sort of fell in love with watching as I was growing up and becoming a college football fan. I think there's a very good chance that both of these teams are ranked within the top 10 or top 15 when this game is played, which seems like something we haven't seen in a while. I think these are both two really good teams, Florida State and Miami. I think either of these teams could make the playoffs. I think maybe both of these teams could make the playoffs. These are two really good teams. In Miami's case, if they don't fall apart and shoot themselves in the foot like Mario Cristobal is known to do. But I do think Florida State goes on the road to Miami and catches a loss. Come back home, I think you'll beat North Carolina. This could be the Mac Brown farewell tour. I think he's running on empty there. They had a chance with Drake May to kind of make a little bit of noise in the ACC, and they weren't able to do it. He's now gone, and I don't like where they're at now as a team. I think you'll get that win, no problem. But then turn right back around and go on the road. This will be the fourth road trip in 4 weeks, the third road trip in 4 weeks on the road at Notre Dame, and I think they beat you too. Your third loss. Now, this is a non-ACC loss, and that is very important to keep in mind as we move forward. But I do think Notre Dame gets the win at home. If this was at Florida State, I'd pick Florida State to win for sure. I think this will be another really, really good game. But I'm giving the nod to Notre Dame because it's at home. They have a bye week, and after that, you end up with Charleston Southern and Florida, two FCS teams. Shout out Billy Napier. The Florida State fans don't like me a whole lot over the last 7 or 8 months but look, I just speak my mind. That's all I do. I speak my mind. Last offseason, I had Florida State in the top 5. Okay? Heading into last season, I had Florida State in the top 5. Did I hate Florida State then? I don't hate Florida State. I just speak my mind. I know y'all don't agree with me with a lot of my thoughts and stuff about the playoffs and how sort of Florida State has handled it. And I know y'all don't agree with me on all that. But something we can agree on, Florida State, man, is our hatred for Florida, the Gators, and Sunbelt Billy. And Florida State will blow out the Gators at home. No problem. Same with Charleston Southern. And Florida State will end the regular season 9-3, but only 2 ACC losses. I don't know how they're going to determine who gets into the ACC championship game. I'm going to do a video where I break down my conference predictions and tell you based off of my prediction videos that I've done, this is who's going to the conference championship games in each conference, and this is who I think is going to win it. But let me just run through some things here real quick when it comes to the ACC. I've got Florida State at 9-3, but that's only 2 ACC losses, okay? Miami and SMU. I've also got NC State at 9-3, but again, only 2 ACC losses. I don't know how they're going to determine these tiebreakers. I've also got Louisville at 9-3, but only 2 ACC losses. I got Louisville losing to Kentucky, NC State losing to Tennessee, and Florida State, of course, losing to Notre Dame. So all of those teams I've got with 3 losses, but only 2 conference losses. How do they determine who's ahead of who? So I'm just telling you, I don't know. Georgia Tech, I've got at 7-5, so they're on the outside looking in. Clemson, I've got at 8-4. They're on the outside looking in. Miami, I've got at 10-2, but both of their losses are ACC losses. So what I have there is 4 ACC teams with 2 losses. Now, I've got 1 ACC team with only 1 loss, and I didn't mention them, and I'm not going to mention them. I'll see if you can figure out who it is based on what I just said there. So I have a pretty good idea of one of the teams that's getting to the ACC title game. I don't know how they would determine the second team if you had a 4-way tie and not everybody played everybody. So I don't know. But I've got Florida State at 9-3. One of those losses is a massive upset, and that's on the road at SMU. If they win that game and they go 10-2 with the exact same losses that I mentioned, Miami and Notre Dame, then that would be only 1 ACC loss, and Florida State would most likely be in the ACC championship game at that point, for sure. And that is more likely to happen, by the way, than my prediction of 9-3. So I know you're going to get really mad in the comments about my 9-3 prediction, but I've already told you, no, there's no way I would bet on Florida State to lose to SMU, and you're more likely to go 10-2 than 9-3. I'll be the first to tell you. Upsets happen. They're hard to pick. But it's kind of boring to just do these prediction videos and just pick the better team to win every single week. I think as far as picking an upset goes, I think I have a legitimate reason to go with SMU. They're a pretty good team. They've got good lines of scrimmage. You're playing them there. It's their first ever ACC game. The crowd will be insane. There's some reasons to sort of go with SMU there, but no, I wouldn't bet a dime on it. But anyway, there you go. That's my prediction. 9-3, only 2 ACC losses, and a probable appearance in the ACC championship game too. Have a good morning. And leave Kirk Herbstreit alone. Seriously, leave that man alone. He didn't do nothing to you.